The sun was just beginning to rise, spilling streaks of orange and gold across the quiet streets of a small, forgotten town. Early mornings like these used to feel full of promise for David Harris, a man who had always believed in waking up before the rest of the world. At 52 years old, David was a veteran of the U.S. military, a man who had served his country with pride and dignity. But these days, the world felt like a very different place. David sat in the cab of his old, beat-up Chevy pickup truck, parked on the side of a construction site. The truck rattled softly as it idled, the engine coughing every now and then, reminding David of its age. The paint was chipped, the upholstery worn out, but it had gotten him through tougher times, and today, it had brought him here, to what he thought would be a fresh start. The heavy weight of a hard hat sat on the passenger seat beside him. David picked it up, turning it in his hands. It was scratched, dented, and faded, like a piece of armor that had seen too many battles. In a way, it had. It had protected him through countless days under the blistering sun and long nights spent building someone else's dreams. For David, this hard hat wasn't just equipment. It was a symbol of hope, a tool that had allowed him to survive when life gave him nothing else. "Today's the day," he muttered to himself, his voice rough and low. He stared through the windshield at the construction site before him. Steel beams stretched high into the sky, scaffolding clung to their edges, and pallets of materials lay stacked in neat rows. It was a half-finished skeleton of a building that would soon become something bigger, something better. For David, it felt symbolic. This job was supposed to be the start of something better, a chance to pick himself up, to prove that he could still be useful. A week ago, Rick, the site manager, had called him. "We're short a few hands, Dave. Show up Monday and you're in." David didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. Construction was the one thing he understood without question. After coming home from the military, adjusting to civilian life had been harder than he expected. He tried other jobs, security guard, factory worker, truck driver, but none of them stuck. Either they didn't pay enough to make a living, or they didn't last long enough to give him stability. But construction had been different. It was physical, honest work. It demanded grit, strength, and precision, qualities that came naturally to a soldier. David found solace in the rhythm of it, the way everything fit together if you just worked hard enough. The paycheck was never glamorous, but it paid the bills, and it gave him a sense of purpose. Lately, though, the jobs had started drying up. Crews were getting younger, faster, and cheaper. David had heard whispers from old buddies at the diner. "They're bringing in new guys, immigrants mostly. They'll work for half the pay." He tried not to think about it, but now, as he sat outside this site, the words crept back into his mind. David exhaled heavily, rubbing his hands together to ward off the morning chill. He grabbed his hard hat, stepped out of the truck, and slammed the door behind him. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way across the lot toward the site manager's trailer. The construction site buzzed with the sounds of drills, hammers, and shouts. Workers moved with speed and efficiency, hauling materials and coordinating tasks. David noticed them immediately. A crew of men wearing yellow vests and hard hats, speaking Spanish as they worked together. They moved quickly, almost too quickly, with an energy that made David feel strangely out of place. "Morning," David said, as he climbed the steps to Rick's trailer and knocked twice on the door. "Come on in," Rick's voice called from inside. David opened the door and stepped in. The office was cluttered, piles of papers, blueprints, and coffee cups scattered across the desk. Rick sat behind it, wearing a baseball cap that shadowed his face. He looked up, and for a moment, there was hesitation in his expression. "Morning, Rick," David said, forcing a smile as he gripped his hard hat in his hand. "I'm here to start." Rick shifted in his chair and scratched the back of his neck, his eyes darting toward the window. Yeah, about that, Dave." David frowned. "What about it? You told me to show up today." Rick sighed, clearly uncomfortable. We already filled the spots." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. "Filled the spots?" he repeated, his voice low. Rick nodded, gesturing vaguely toward the site outside the window. "Some guys showed up last week looking for work. We were short, so I had to hire them on the spot. They're good workers, reliable, you know?" David turned to look out the trailer window. The crew outside caught his eye again, men lifting pallets, unloading equipment, and calling out instructions in Spanish. They worked fast and efficiently, laughing with each other in between tasks. David's chest tightened. "You hired them?" Rick gave a weak shrug. "It's just how it worked out. Look, I'll call you if anything else opens up." David didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the trailer, slamming the door behind him. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting harsh light across the construction site. He stood there for a moment, staring at the men working where he was supposed to be. "They took my spot," he muttered, his voice tinged with bitterness. The words echoed in his mind as he trudged back to his truck. He threw the hard hat onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, anger, resentment, and frustration swirling like a storm. "I fought for this country," he whispered. "I earned my place." He looked back at the site one last time. The men didn't notice him. They were too busy working, focused, and determined. David's stomach churned as he turned the key in the ignition. The truck groaned to life, but the unease in his chest stayed with him as he drove away. As the truck rattled down the road, David couldn't stop thinking about what Rick had said. "They're reliable, hardworking." The words cut deep, as if they were a judgment of him, of his worth, his age, his ability to keep up in a world that seemed to be leaving him behind. He thought about his service days, about the nights he spent in trenches, cold and sleepless, so that others wouldn't have to. He thought about the friends he'd lost, the sacrifices he'd made. Back then, being American meant something. It came with respect, with honor. But now, it felt like all of that had been forgotten. David tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw clenched. "They took my spot," he said again, this time louder. But deep down, a small voice in his mind whispered something else, something he didn't want to hear. Did they really take it? Or did someone else give it away? He pushed the thought aside and focused on the road ahead. David's truck creaked to a stop in his driveway, the same spot it had sat for years. He climbed out, slamming the door behind him harder than he needed to. The small single-story house stood silently, chipped paint on the front steps, grass grown uneven in the yard, and a sagging mailbox barely hanging on. It wasn't much, but it was his. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. David tossed his hard hat onto the kitchen table, sending a stack of unopened bills skidding across the surface. He rubbed his temples, the anger from the morning still simmering. The walls stared back at him, blank, except for one shelf of framed photographs and dusty military medals. There he was in his youth, fresh-faced and full of promise, standing in uniform with his platoon. There were a few letters of commendation, but their meaning felt hollow now. He was a man who had fought for his country, but the country didn't seem to have much left for him in return. The words echoed again in his head. "They took my spot." Later that day, David found himself back at Susan's diner, his regular haunt. The coffee was cheap, the stools at the counter cracked and weathered, and the air thick with the smell of bacon grease. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and gossip was served as freely as the coffee refills. David sat in his usual spot, a scowl etched into his face. Across from him, a group of older men, locals like him, grumbled over their breakfast plates. "Tell me how this makes sense," one of them said, slapping the counter for emphasis. "We fought for this country, we built this country, and now they're handing everything to people who just got here?" Another man, his voice bitter, chimed in. "Cheap labor, that's what they want. They'll hire those guys for pennies, and then they've got no reason to hire us. It's not fair." David stared into his cup, swirling the dark coffee around like it held the answers he was searching for. Their words were hitting a nerve, validating the resentment he already felt. But beneath it all, there was still something gnawing at him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "They don't deserve it," one man muttered. "Not like we do." David's fists clenched at his sides. He understood their frustration, he felt it too. But something about the anger didn't sit right with him. He kept quiet, leaving a crumpled $5 bill on the counter as he walked out. Unable to let it go, David found himself parked across the street from the construction site again the next morning. It was like something was pulling him back there, an invisible force keeping him tethered to the place where everything fell apart. He sat in his truck, watching the crew work. They were a well-oiled machine. The men moved with precision and speed, lifting beams, laying down materials, and measuring twice before they cut. Miguel, the man David had confronted the day before, was clearly in charge. He didn't bark orders or raise his voice. Instead, he worked alongside the crew, guiding them with respect and quiet authority. David found himself strangely fascinated by the rhythm of it all. These men were nothing like the lazy stereotypes he had heard so many times. They worked with pride, as if every task mattered. David's anger twisted into confusion. How could they take something from him if they were working this hard for it? Suddenly, Miguel looked up and spotted David across the street. For a moment, their eyes met. Miguel raised a hand in a wave, not mocking, not angry, just an acknowledgement. David hesitated before driving away, his chest tight and his thoughts swirling. Later that day, David returned to the site. This time, he didn't know exactly why he was there. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was pride, maybe it was something else entirely. He parked, grabbed his old gloves from the seat, and walked across the gravel lot. Miguel saw him coming and straightened up, his face calm as ever. "You again?" Miguel said, though there was no hostility in his tone. "You looking for Rick?" David shook his head. "Number, I just wanted to talk." Miguel nodded and gestured toward a pallet of bricks. "Well, I'm listening. Want to give me a hand while you're at it?" David hesitated, his pride flaring, but something about Miguel's unbothered demeanor made it hard to say no. Without a word, David bent down, picked up a brick, and followed Miguel's lead. They worked side by side for nearly half an hour, the silence between them punctuated only by the sounds of labor. Finally, Miguel broke the silence. "You served, didn't you?" David glanced up, surprised. "Yeah, Army, 8 years. Miguel nodded, his brow furrowed with respect. "My brother served too, in Mexico. Military service runs in my family. We believe in working for something bigger than ourselves." David swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to hearing words like those from men like Miguel. "I came here because there was no future where I was," Miguel continued. "Back home, I couldn't feed my family. Here, at least there's a chance." David frowned, his voice low. "A chance at what? Taking jobs from guys like me?" Miguel stopped what he was doing, turning to face David. "Taking jobs? Or taking opportunities that nobody else wanted? This isn't about you or me. It's about survival. You fought for this country, yes? I work for it. We're not so different." David opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. Miguel picked up another brick and went back to work, leaving David to stew in his thoughts. The next day, David showed up at the construction site again. This time, he brought his hard hat and gloves. He didn't say anything to Rick or the crew. He just walked up to Miguel. "Need another hand?" David asked quietly. Miguel smiled, handing him a pair of work gloves. "Always." David spent the day working with the crew. It was grueling work, hauling heavy materials, laying foundations, and hammering beams into place. But it felt familiar. The men around him spoke a mix of Spanish and English, cracking jokes and sharing stories as they worked. By lunchtime, David was drenched in sweat and sore, but for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. Miguel sat beside him during their break, passing him a tinfoil-wrapped burrito. "Eat. You'll need it." David hesitated before unwrapping it. "Thanks." As they ate, David listened to the crew. Some spoke of their families back home, the sacrifices they made to send money. Others talked about their dreams, owning businesses, building homes, creating better lives for their kids. David realized something. These men weren't his enemies. They were like him, hardworking, tired, and just trying to survive in a world that rarely made things easy. "They're good men," Miguel said, as if reading his thoughts. David nodded. "Yeah, they are." That night, David couldn't stop thinking about everything Miguel had said. The next morning, he went to the local Veterans Center. It was a place where men like him, forgotten and adrift, tried to find their footing. David joined a small group of younger vets who were venting about life after service. "There's nothing for us out here," one man said bitterly. "They give the jobs to other people." David, for the first time, felt compelled to speak up. "I used to think that too," he admitted. "But let me tell you something I've learned. It's not us against them. It's us against the system that keeps us fighting each other instead of fighting for each other." The group quieted, listening intently as David shared his experience. He told them about Miguel, about the crew, about the hard truth he had come to understand, that survival wasn't about taking from one another, it was about helping each other rise. In the weeks that followed, David continued working with Miguel's crew. The walls that divided them slowly disappeared. They weren't just co-workers anymore. They were brothers in labor, bonded by sweat, respect, and shared dreams. David found purpose again, not in fighting against others, but in building something alongside them. One evening, after finishing a project, Miguel approached David with something small in his hand. It was a wooden plaque, carved with careful hands. David looked at it, his throat tight. The word family was etched across it. "You're one of us now," Miguel said simply. David stared at the plaque for a long moment, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. The sun was setting as David stood alongside Miguel and the rest of the crew, looking at the finished project. The building stood tall and proud, a symbol of effort, precision, and teamwork. David felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle in his chest, the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing something through to the end. Miguel clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "Good work today, amigo. You earned that beer tonight." David chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll take a coffee instead." They stood there quietly for a moment, watching as the other men packed up tools and cleaned the site. David didn't see immigrants or cheap labor anymore. He saw fathers, sons, and brothers, men like himself, who were just trying to carve out a spot in the world for their families. The next day, David sat in his truck parked at Susan's diner, reflecting on how far he'd come. A group of the same old-timers he'd listened to weeks before were still there, grumbling about the same things: jobs, outsiders, and unfairness. This time, David didn't stay silent. He grabbed his coffee and walked over. "You know," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I thought like you once. Figured someone else was taking what should have been mine." The men turned to look at him, their expressions curious and guarded. "But the truth is," David continued, "it's not about them taking anything. It's about who's giving it away. Those men work hard, damn hard, just like we did when we were younger. Maybe it's time we stopped fighting each other and started fighting for something better." The men fell silent, some looking down, others shifting uncomfortably. David didn't expect to change their minds in a single conversation, but he knew he had spoken the truth, and that was enough. A week later, Miguel handed David a hammer with his name engraved into the handle. "You're part of the crew now, hermano," Miguel said. David smiled, the knot of resentment in his chest finally gone. He looked at the crew, his new brothers, and nodded. "They didn't take my spot," he thought to himself. "They gave me a place." David had found something greater than anger, acceptance, understanding, and purpose. And for the first time in years, he felt like he truly belonged.